Chapter 1. The Foundation. Marshall Connolly had always been a man who built his life like a fortress, methodical, precise, and unforgiving to those who dared breach its walls. At 32, he stood 6'2" with steel gray eyes that seemed to calculate every angle before speaking. His military background had taught him patience, strategy, and most importantly, that mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. He'd met Marcia Nicholson 8 years ago at a veterans charity event in Charlotte. She was radiant then, auburn hair cascading over her shoulders, green eyes that sparkled with what he'd mistaken for loyalty. Marcia worked in marketing for a mid-sized tech firm, and her quick wit and infectious laughter had drawn him in completely. They married after 2 years of courtship, and Marshall believed he'd found his anchor. The first crack in their foundation came during his second deployment to Afghanistan. Marcia's calls became shorter, more distant. She claimed stress from work, pressure from her demanding boss, Craig Savage. Marshall knew Craig by reputation, a smooth-talking executive who'd climbed the corporate ladder through charm and calculated manipulation. At 45, Craig was everything Marshall despised, a man who took shortcuts and preyed on the vulnerable. During his deployment, Marshall had started noticing inconsistencies in Marcia's stories. Late nights at the office became the norm. Weekend team-building events. Her excuses multiplied like compound interest, and Marshall's suspicions grew with military precision. He'd survived 3 tours by trusting his instincts, and every instinct screamed betrayal. But Marshall was patient. He documented everything: timestamps of calls, background noises, the gradual shift in Marcia's tone. He learned that Craig Savage had a pattern. The man was a predator who'd been married 3 times, each marriage ending when he found his next conquest. Marshall began building a psychological profile of his wife's boss, studying him like an enemy combatant. The breaking point came 6 months into his deployment. Marcia had stopped wearing her wedding ring in photos, a detail she thought he wouldn't notice. But Marshall noticed everything. He started preparing for war, not the kind fought with bullets and bombs, but the kind fought with patience, intelligence, and the systematic destruction of his enemies. Chapter 2. The Call. The satellite phone crackled with static as Marshall answered from his forward operating base in Helmand Province. It was 0300 hours, and incoming calls at this time usually meant emergency or death. He never expected it to deliver both. Marcia's voice sounded different, breathless, excited, guilty. "I'm here," he replied, his tone measured despite the alarms ringing in his head. "I need to tell you something." The pause stretched like a chasm. "I'm pregnant." Marshall's grip on the phone tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Congratulations. When did you find out?" Another pause. Then the words that would seal 3 fates. "It's not yours, Marshall. It's Craig's. My boss. We're getting married. I want a divorce." The compound around him fell silent except for the distant hum of generators. Marshall's fellow soldiers continued their routines, unaware that they were witnessing the birth of something dangerous. "I see," Marshall said, his tone so calm it was unsettling. "And you're certain about the paternity?" Marcia's voice gained confidence, mistaking his control for weakness. "Yes, I'm certain. Marshall, I'm sorry, but this is what I want. Craig loves me, and that child will never know him," Marshall interrupted, the words delivered with the precision of a surgical strike. Marshall laughed, a sound that would echo in Marshall's mind for weeks. "What's that supposed to mean? Are you threatening us?" Marshall ended the call without another word. Around him, the base continued its operations, but something fundamental had shifted. The Marshall who'd answered that phone was gone, replaced by something colder, more calculating. He walked to his footlocker and retrieved a notebook, leather-bound, filled with meticulous observations about people back home. He turned to a fresh page and wrote, "Craig Savage, target acquired." For the next hour, Marshall sat in silence, constructing what would become Craig Savage's epitaph. He thought about Marcia's laugh, about Craig's pattern of destroying marriages, about the child who would grow up believing a lie. By dawn, Marshall had a plan that would unfold with the precision of a military operation. He made 2 phone calls before breakfast. The first was to his commanding officer, requesting emergency leave for a family crisis. The second was to a private investigator he'd worked with during his civilian security days, Isaac Lawrence, a man who specialized in finding people's deepest secrets. "Isaac," Marshall said when the call connected. I need everything you can find on Craig Savage. Employment history, financial records, personal relationships, medical records, parking tickets, everything. And I need it fast. How fast? Isaac asked. I'll be stateside in 72 hours. I want his life story waiting for me. As Marshall began preparing for his return, word spread quickly through the base about his early departure. His squad leader, Sergeant Theodore Wall, approached him during equipment check. Everything all right at home, Connolly? Marshall looked up from his gear, and Theodore saw something in those gray eyes that made him step back. Everything's about to be, Marshall replied. The flight home would take 36 hours. Marshall spent every minute of it refining his strategy, anticipating variables, preparing for a war that Craig Savage didn't even know had been declared. Chapter 3. Homecoming. Marshall's boots touched American soil on a Thursday morning in October. The Charlotte airport bustled with travelers, but he moved through the crowd like a ghost, present but not entirely there. His duffel bag contained more than just personal effects. Hidden in a sealed compartment were untraceable burner phones, cash, and documents that officially didn't exist. Isaac Lawrence waited at baggage claim, his weathered face grim. At 58, Isaac had spent 30 years as a police detective before going private. He specialized in cases others wouldn't touch, and he'd never seen Marshall this focused. You look like hell, Isaac said by way of greeting. I feel like clarity, Marshall replied, shouldering his bag. Tell me about Craig Savage. They drove to a secure location, a storage facility Isaac maintained for sensitive meetings. Inside Unit 47B, Isaac had created a makeshift war room. Photos, documents, and surveillance equipment lined the walls like evidence in a murder case. Craig Savage is a predator, Isaac began, pointing to a timeline on the wall. 3 marriages, all ending the same way. He targets married women in vulnerable situations, usually employees or clients. Your wife fits his pattern perfectly. Marshall studied the photos of Craig's previous victims. Sarah Winters, divorced after Craig convinced her that her husband was emotionally abusive. Linda Porter, whose marriage ended when Craig fed her suspicions about her husband's fidelity. The pattern was clear and devastating. What about finances? Marshall asked. Clean, unfortunately. No embezzlement, no fraud. He's careful about that. But there's something else. Isaac pulled out a medical file. Craig has a severe allergy to shellfish. Anaphylactic shock level. He carries an EpiPen everywhere. Marshall absorbed this information like intelligence about enemy fortifications. What about personal habits? Gym every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 a.m. Drinks at Harrington's bar every Friday after work. Lives alone in a downtown condo. Drives a leased BMW, replaced every 2 years. Isaac paused. Marshall, whatever you're planning. I'm planning to give Craig Savage exactly what he deserves, Marshall interrupted. Nothing more, nothing less. That evening, Marshall checked into a hotel under an assumed name. He spent the next 4 days conducting surveillance, learning Craig's routines with military precision. He watched Craig meet Marcia for lunch, saw them laugh together, witnessed the casual intimacy that should have been his. But Marshall felt nothing. The emotional part of him had died with that phone call. What remained was pure calculation. On the 5th day, Marshall made contact. He called Craig's office, introducing himself as a potential client interested in the company's security consulting services. Craig, always eager for new business, agreed to meet for drinks at Harrington's bar. I'm recently back from overseas, Marshall explained during their call. Military contracting. I've got some connections that might be mutually beneficial. Craig's greed was predictable. Friday at 7? I'll be there. As Marshall hung up, he allowed himself the smallest smile. Phase 1 was complete. Craig Savage had willingly entered the trap, drawn by the same avarice that drove him to steal other men's wives. Marshall spent Thursday preparing. He studied Craig's medical records, researched anaphylactic shock symptoms, and acquired what he needed through channels that existed in the gray areas of legality. By Friday evening, he was ready. The psychological profile Isaac had constructed proved invaluable. Craig Savage was a man driven by ego, greed, and the thrill of taking what belonged to others. Those same traits would become his destruction. As Marshall dressed for their meeting, he thought about Marcia's laugh from that phone call. Soon, she would learn what it meant to cross a man who never forgot and never forgave. Chapter 4. The Meeting. Harrington's bar occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in Charlotte's financial district. The atmosphere was deliberately sophisticated, dark wood, leather furniture, and the kind of lighting that made everyone look successful. Craig Savage had chosen his hunting ground well. Marshall arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a corner table with clear sight lines to all exits. Old habits from the military. He ordered bourbon, neat, and waited. Craig entered at exactly 7 o'clock, scanning the bar with the confidence of a man who owned every room he entered. At 45, he maintained the physique of someone who fought aging with expensive trainers and cosmetic procedures. His suit was Italian, his watch Swiss, and his smile practiced. Marshall Connolly? Craig extended his hand, his grip firm but not quite sincere. Mr. Savage, thank you for meeting with me. Marshall's handshake was measured, strong enough to show respect, not so strong as to reveal his true physical condition. They ordered drinks. Craig chose an expensive scotch, making a show of discussing the vintage with the bartender. Marshall observed everything. The way Craig positioned himself to see the entire bar, how he unconsciously touched his left jacket pocket where the EpiPen rested, the predatory assessment of every woman who entered his field of vision. So, Craig said, settling back in his chair, Isaac mentioned you're looking for security consulting. What kind of operation are you running? Marshall had prepared for this question. Private military contracting, mainly training and logistics for overseas operations. But I'm looking to diversify stateside. Corporate security, executive protection, that sort of thing. Craig's eyes lit up with the unmistakable gleam of opportunity. Interesting. We've been considering upgrading our security protocols. Some of our clients handle sensitive information. I understand you have experience with delicate situations, Marshall said, letting his gaze drift to Craig's wedding ring finger, conspicuously bare despite Isaac's intelligence indicating Craig was engaged to Marcia. You could say that. Craig's smile turned predatory. I've learned that business and personal relationships often require similar skills. Reading people, identifying weaknesses, knowing when to apply pressure. Marshall nodded thoughtfully. Like identifying unhappy marriages among employees? Craig's expression shifted slightly, but his smile remained. I'm not sure what you mean. Of course not. Marshall raised his glass. To reading people correctly. They drank, and Marshall began deploying the psychological pressure Isaac's profile had suggested would be most effective. He talked about overseas contracts, about the loneliness of military life, about the difficulty of maintaining relationships across long distances. The hardest part, Marshall said, is coming home to find everything's changed. People you trusted, situations you thought were stable. He let the sentence hang. Craig leaned forward, sensing vulnerability he could exploit. I've seen that happen. Military marriages have unique stresses. Sometimes people grow apart, find connection with others who understand their immediate needs. Sometimes they do, Marshall agreed. Tell me, Craig. May I call you Craig? Do you have family? Someone waiting at home. I'm actually engaged, Craig said, his pride evident. To a wonderful woman named Marcia. She works in my company's marketing department. Marshall's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker that Craig mistook for surprise rather than recognition. Marcia Nicholson? Marshall asked. Craig's smile faltered. You know her? We've met. Marshall's tone remained conversational, but the temperature at their table seemed to drop several degrees. Small world. The next 30 minutes were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Marshall revealed just enough information about his connection to Marcia to unsettle Craig without triggering immediate flight. He talked about trust, about loyalty, about the consequences of betraying men who were trained to eliminate threats. Craig's confidence eroded with each carefully placed comment. His tells became obvious, touching his throat when nervous, checking his phone for messages from Marcia, unconsciously reaching for the pocket containing his EpiPen. You seem uncomfortable, Marshall observed. Is everything all right? Fine, Craig said, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. Just wondering, how exactly do you know Marcia? Marshall smiled for the first time that evening, and Craig immediately wished he'd kept his questions to himself. We were married, Marshall said simply, for 7 years. Until recently. The blood drained from Craig's face. Marshall Connolly, you're her husband, the one deployed in Afghanistan, the one she called 6 weeks ago. Marshall's voice remained calm, conversational, as if discussing the weather. The one she told about the pregnancy. Craig started to stand, but Marshall's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with controlled strength. Sit down, Craig. We're not finished talking. For the first time in years, Craig Savage found himself on the receiving end of the predatory behavior he'd perfected. And he was beginning to understand that Marshall Connolly was far more dangerous than any divorced husband he'd encountered before. Chapter 5. The Trap. Craig Savage's world had tilted off its axis in the span of a single conversation. The man across from him, Marcia's supposedly absent husband, radiated a controlled menace that made Craig's blood run cold. Every instinct screamed for him to leave, but Marshall's grip on his wrist remained firm, and his gray eyes held the promise of violence barely contained. "Let me go," Craig whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating. Marshall released his wrist, but remained leaning forward. "I said we weren't finished talking. You've been very busy while I was overseas, Craig. Building relationships, breaking commitments, making promises you can't keep. Look, Marshall, if I can call you Marshall, I didn't know you were still. Marcia said you were divorced." "Did she?" Marshall's smile was razor thin. "That's interesting. When exactly did she tell you that?" Craig's mind raced, trying to calculate how much Marshall knew, how much he could safely admit. "I don't remember exactly. A few months ago, maybe. Try 8 months ago," Marshall said quietly. "Right around the time I was dodging IEDs in Helmand Province. While I was fighting for our country, you were dismantling my marriage piece by piece." The bar continued its normal rhythm around them. Laughter, conversations, the clink of glasses, but their corner table had become an island of tension. Craig glanced toward the exit, measuring distances. "I wouldn't," Marshall said, following his gaze. "We have so much more to discuss. Like your pattern, Craig. Sarah Winters, Linda Porter, now Marcia. Always the same approach. Identify the vulnerable wife, exploit her loneliness, convince her that her husband is the problem." Craig's face went pale. "How do you know about?" "I know everything about you," Marshall interrupted. "Your allergies, your routines, your weaknesses. I've studied you like an enemy target, because that's exactly what you are." The psychological pressure was methodical, relentless. Marshall had learned interrogation techniques that could break trained soldiers. Craig Savage stood no chance. With each revelation of intimate knowledge about Craig's life and patterns, the man across from him crumbled further. "What do you want?" Craig finally asked, his voice barely audible. "I want you to understand the consequences of your actions," Marshall replied. "You see, Craig, I'm not like the other husbands you've destroyed. They were civilians, soft, unprepared for war. But you've declared war on the wrong man." Marshall signaled for another round of drinks, maintaining the facade of a business meeting. When the waitress arrived, he smiled pleasantly, the perfect picture of professionalism. "Craig here was just telling me about his upcoming marriage," Marshall said to the waitress. "Aren't you excited, Craig?" Craig managed a weak nod, trapped between maintaining appearances and the growing terror of his situation. After the waitress left, Marshall continued his psychological assault. "I've been thinking about your future together. You and Marcia and the baby. It's going to be challenging, building a family on a foundation of betrayal. Children have a way of sensing dishonesty in their parents." "The baby isn't even born yet," Craig protested weakly. "No, but it's already shaping your future. Tell me, Craig, have you considered how you'll explain to this child why their mother's first marriage ended? Will you teach them that commitments are disposable? That loyalty is weakness?" Each question was a surgical strike against Craig's psychological defenses. Marshall had identified the man's core weakness, his need to see himself as the hero of his own story. By forcing Craig to confront the reality of his actions, Marshall was systematically destroying that narrative. "You're trying to make me feel guilty," Craig said, attempting to regain some control. "I don't need to make you feel anything," Marshall replied. "Guilt requires a conscience. I'm simply helping you understand the situation you've created." Marshall reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila envelope. He placed it on the table between them. "This contains documentation of your pattern. Photos, communications, witness statements. Everything needed to demonstrate that you're a predator who systematically destroys marriages." Craig's eyes fixed on the envelope like it contained a bomb. "What are you going to do with that?" "That depends entirely on you," Marshall said. "You have a choice to make, Craig. You can continue down this path, marry my wife, raise my child, and face the consequences of your actions. Or you can disappear from their lives voluntarily. You can't threaten me. I'm not threatening you, Marshall interrupted, his tone remaining conversational. I'm offering you an opportunity to salvage what remains of your dignity. But understand this, whether you choose option 1 or option 2, the outcome for you will be the same. The only variable is how much suffering you endure before we reach that conclusion. Craig stared at the envelope, then at Marshall's impassive face. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't a negotiation, it was a sentencing hearing. I need time to think, Craig said finally. Marshall stood, leaving money on the table for their drinks. You have 48 hours to make your decision. After that, I'll make it for you. As Marshall walked away, Craig remained frozen at the table, staring at the envelope that contained his future. He didn't yet realize that regardless of his choice, Marshall had already decided his fate. The 48-hour deadline wasn't for Craig's decision. It was the countdown to his destruction. Chapter 6. The Execution. Craig Savage spent the next 48 hours in a state of paranoid terror that would have been amusing if Marshall had been capable of amusement anymore. Through surveillance equipment Isaac had provided, Marshall watched Craig's world unravel in real time. The first day, Craig called in sick to work and spent the morning pacing his downtown condo, repeatedly checking locks and drawing curtains. He tried calling Marcia 17 times, but Marshall had anticipated this. A sophisticated signal jamming device ensured Craig's calls went straight to voicemail. By the second day, Craig's psychological state had deteriorated significantly. Sleep deprivation, paranoia, and the constant fear of when Marshall might appear had reduced him to a shadow of his former arrogant self. He'd attempted to leave the city twice, each time turning back when he spotted unmarked vehicles that may or may not have been following him. Marshall's strategy was working perfectly. Craig was isolating himself, making erratic decisions, becoming increasingly unstable. The perfect conditions for what would come next. Thursday evening, exactly 48 hours after their meeting, Marshall made his move. He waited until Craig left his condo for his usual gym session, one of the few routines the man hadn't abandoned in his paranoia. The Meridian Athletic Club was Craig's sanctuary, a place where he felt safe among the familiar faces of Charlotte's business elite. Marshall had spent weeks studying the facility's layout, staff schedules, and security protocols. The club's kitchen maintained a fully stocked raw bar, including fresh shellfish that arrived daily. More importantly, the kitchen staff rotated shifts at 7 p.m., creating a 15-minute window where the prep area was unsupervised. At 7:05 p.m., Marshall entered through the service entrance using credentials Isaac had acquired. He moved through the kitchen with military precision, locating the shellfish prep station. His modifications to Craig's pre-workout protein shake were subtle but lethal. Concentrated shellfish proteins dissolved in a solution designed to bypass taste and smell detection. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Craig's severe shellfish allergy was well documented in his medical records. Emergency rooms saw dozens of accidental exposures every year. No one would question the tragic accident of a man who forgot to check the ingredients in his gym's new protein blend. Marshall was already gone when Craig arrived at the gym. Through earpiece communication with Isaac, who monitored from a nearby vehicle, Marshall listened as events unfolded exactly as planned. 7:23 p.m., Craig began his workout routine. 7:35 p.m., Craig consumed his protein shake at the juice bar. 7:41 p.m., Craig started experiencing difficulty breathing. 7:43 p.m., Craig collapsed during his bench press session. The 911 call came at 7:44 p.m. Marshall was 15 miles away, sitting in a restaurant with a time-stamped receipt that would establish his alibi. By the time paramedics arrived, Craig Savage was beyond the help of the EpiPen in his gym bag. The official cause of death was anaphylactic shock due to accidental shellfish exposure. The health department cited the gym for inadequate allergen warnings on their protein supplements. Craig's family, estranged siblings who'd seen him only at funerals, made arrangements for a small, private service. Marshall attended the funeral, not to gloat, but to observe. He watched from a distance as Marcia stood graveside, her hand unconsciously covering her growing belly, tears streaming down her face. She believed she was mourning the love of her life. Marshall knew better. She was mourning a predator who had finally found prey that fought back. After the service, Marshall approached her. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, his tone perfectly calibrated to convey sympathy without warmth. Marcia looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Marshall? What are you doing here? I heard about Craig's accident. I know how much he meant to you." Something in his tone made her study his face more carefully. "How did you know about Craig?" Marshall's expression remained neutral, but Marcia saw something in his eyes that made her step backward. "I make it my business to know about the people who matter to my wife." "Ex-wife," Marcia corrected quickly. "Are we divorced, Marcia? I don't recall signing any papers." The realization hit her like a physical blow. In her rush to start her new life with Craig, she'd never actually filed for divorce. Legally, she was still married to Marshall, making her relationship with Craig and her pregnancy a much more complicated situation. "I'll file the papers tomorrow," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Marshall smiled, and for the first time since receiving her phone call in Afghanistan, the expression reached his eyes. "Of course you will. But first, we need to talk about the future. About the child. About what happens next." As they stood beside Craig Savage's grave, Marcia began to understand that her husband's return marked not the end of her troubles, but the beginning of something far more dangerous. Marshall had eliminated one problem, but he wasn't finished. The real reckoning was just beginning. Chapter 7, Revelation. 3 weeks after Craig Savage's funeral, Marcia discovered she was living in a carefully constructed nightmare. The realization came in fragments, small inconsistencies that gradually formed a terrifying picture of manipulation and calculated revenge. It started with the insurance investigator. Detective Emmanuel Rodriguez from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department knocked on her apartment door on a rainy Tuesday evening. He was a compact man with intelligent eyes who apologized for the late hour before delivering news that shattered her fragile peace. "Mrs. Connolly," he said, noting her surprise at the name. "I'm investigating some irregularities surrounding Mr. Savage's death." Irregularities? Marcia's hand unconsciously moved to her belly, now showing at 5 months. The gym's security footage shows an unauthorized person in the kitchen area the evening Mr. Savage died. "We're trying to identify this individual." Rodriguez showed her a grainy still frame from the security camera. The figure was deliberately obscured, but something about the posture, the confident movement through shadows, made her blood run cold. "Do you recognize this person?" Rodriguez asked. Marcia stared at the image, her heart pounding. I'm not sure." After Rodriguez left, Marcia called the one person she thought she could trust, Isaac Lawrence, the private investigator Craig had mentioned hiring to look into some business matters. What she discovered during that conversation destroyed the last of her illusions. "Isaac, this is Marcia Nicholson, Craig Savage's fiancée. I need to ask you about some work you were doing for him." The pause on the other end of the line stretched too long. "Mrs. Nicholson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Craig said he hired you to investigate some business partners." "Ma'am, I've never worked for Craig Savage. But I have worked extensively for your husband." The phone slipped from Marcia's nerveless fingers. When she picked it up, Isaac was still talking. "Detailed background investigation, surveillance reports, psychological profiles. Mrs. Connolly, your husband knows everything about Craig Savage's death because he planned every detail." That night, Marcia sat in her darkened apartment, pieces of the puzzle falling into place with horrible clarity. Marshall's unexpected early return from deployment, his calm reaction to her news, the timing of Craig's death, the convenient accident that eliminated the man who'd stolen his wife and unborn child. She thought about their conversation at the funeral, about the cold intelligence in Marshall's eyes when he'd reminded her they were still legally married, about how he'd known exactly where to find her, how he'd appeared at just the right moment to offer sympathy that felt more like a threat. Her phone rang at midnight. Marshall's voice was warm, almost loving. "Hello, Marcia. I hope I'm not calling too late. You killed him." The words came out as a whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't catch that. You killed Craig. You murdered him." Marshall's silence stretched for 30 seconds. When he spoke again, his tone remained gentle, almost sad. "Marcia, I think grief is affecting your judgment. Craig died from an allergic reaction. It was a tragic accident. The investigator showed me security footage." "Of what? A blurry figure that could be anyone?" "Marcia, you're creating patterns that don't exist. You're seeing conspiracies because you can't accept that the man you chose over your husband died from his own carelessness. But Marcia knew. With the clarity that comes from absolute terror, she understood that she was carrying the child of a dead man while still legally married to his killer. And Marshall, patient, methodical Marshall, was just getting started. "I want a divorce," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "We'll discuss it when I get home," Marshall replied. "Home? You don't live here anymore." "Actually, I do. I never gave up the lease on our apartment. I'll be moving back in tomorrow. We have so much to discuss about our future together. About the baby. About what it means to be a family." The line went dead, leaving Marcia alone with the growing certainty that Craig's death had been just the opening move in a game she was only beginning to understand. And tomorrow, the man who had orchestrated that death would be sharing her home, sleeping in the room next to hers, playing the role of the returning husband while she carried another man's child. She thought about running, but where could she go that Marshall wouldn't find her? He'd tracked down and eliminated Craig Savage with military precision. A pregnant woman with limited resources wouldn't pose much of a challenge. As she packed what few belongings she could carry, Marcia made a decision that would define everything that followed. If Marshall wanted to play the role of the returning husband, she would play the role of the grieving widow. But unlike Craig, she wouldn't underestimate the man she was fighting. She retrieved the small silver pistol Craig had given her for protection, a gift that had seemed unnecessary at the time, but now felt like her only lifeline. Tomorrow, when Marshall came home to reclaim his life, he would find a very different woman than the one who had betrayed him. The war Craig Savage had started through his seduction was far from over. It was about to enter its most dangerous phase. Chapter 8. The Confrontation. Marshall returned to their shared apartment the next evening carrying a single military duffel bag and a bouquet of white lilies, Marcia's favorite flowers, though she'd forgotten she'd ever told him that. The gesture was perfectly calculated, intimate enough to remind her of their shared history, cold enough to feel like a memorial arrangement. Marcia waited in the living room she'd once shared with her husband, the small silver pistol hidden in her handbag on the coffee table. 6 months pregnant now, she felt clumsy and vulnerable, but her resolve had crystallized into something hard and unyielding. If Marshall thought her pregnancy made her helpless, he was about to learn otherwise. "Hello, Marcia." Marshall's voice carried the same controlled warmth he'd used at Craig's funeral. "You look beautiful. Motherhood suits you." "Cut the act, Marshall. I know what you did." He set the flowers on the kitchen counter with deliberate care, then turned to face her. His gray eyes held no surprise, no defensiveness, only the patient attention of a predator who'd expected this conversation. "And what exactly do you think I did?" "You murdered Craig. You planned it, executed it, and now you're here too." She gestured helplessly at the domestic tableau he was creating. "What? Pretend we're a happy family." Marshall moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. Craig Savage died from anaphylactic shock. The coroner confirmed it. The health department filed their report. Case closed. The security footage shows an unidentified figure who could be any of a dozen kitchen staff members. Marshall's tone remained conversational. "You're grieving, Marcia. You're looking for someone to blame for Craig's death because accepting that it was a random accident makes you feel powerless. You're a monster," she whispered. For the first time, Marshall's expression shifted, not to anger or offense, but to something that looked almost like disappointment. "I'm a man who protects what belongs to him." Craig Savage took something that wasn't his to take. He faced the consequences of that choice. "I chose him. I chose to be with Craig because he made me feel alive in ways you never could." "Did he?" Marshall turned from the window, his gaze settling on her with uncomfortable intensity. "Or did he simply tell you what you wanted to hear while systematically isolating you from everything stable in your life? Did Craig make you feel alive, Marcia, or did he make you feel desperate?" The question hit closer to home than she wanted to admit. Craig's love had felt urgent, thrilling, but also constantly precarious. She'd lived in fear of losing his attention, of being replaced by the next lonely wife who caught his eye. "It doesn't matter now," she said. "He's dead, and you killed him. Let's say, hypothetically, that your theory is correct," Marshall said, settling into the armchair across from her. "Let's say I did eliminate the man who destroyed my marriage and corrupted my wife. What exactly do you plan to do about it?" Marcia's hand moved toward her handbag, but Marshall's keen eyes caught the motion immediately. "Ah," he said softly. "The pistol Craig gave you. A Beretta Bobcat, .25 caliber. Not much stopping power, but effective at close range if you know what you're doing." Her blood turned to ice. "How do you know about the gun?" "Because I know everything about you, Marcia. Everything about your life with Craig, everything about your plans, everything about your fears." Marshall leaned forward slightly, including the fact that the gun isn't loaded. With trembling fingers, Marcia pulled the pistol from her bag and checked the chamber. Empty. The magazine had been removed. "I found it yesterday while you were at your doctor's appointment," Marshall explained calmly. "Did you really think I'd allow you to keep a weapon you might use against me? I've been planning this reunion for months, Marcia. Every variable has been accounted for." The crushing weight of his preparation settled over her like a burial shroud. Marshall hadn't just killed Craig. He'd been orchestrating every aspect of her life while she grieved, manipulating her actions while she thought she was making independent choices. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I want you to understand your situation clearly," Marshall replied. "You're carrying another man's child, but you're legally married to me. Craig Savage is dead, whether by accident or design, is ultimately irrelevant. You have no money of your own, no family support, and no evidence of any crime that wouldn't implicate you as an adulteress seeking to harm her husband." He stood and walked to the kitchen, returning with the bouquet of lilies. The funeral symbolism wasn't lost on either of them. "Your choices are simple," he continued. "You can accept that your marriage to me continues, raise the child with my name and my support, and we can build something resembling a functional family. Or you can continue to fight a war you've already lost." Marcia stared at the empty pistol in her hands, understanding for the first time the complete scope of Marshall's victory. He hadn't just eliminated Craig. He'd systematically removed every avenue of escape, every source of support, every weapon she might use against him. "I'll never love you again," she said. Marshall's smile was sad but not surprised. "Love was never a requirement, Marcia. Loyalty was. You failed that test once. You won't get another chance." As he moved toward the bedroom to unpack his things, Marcia realized that Craig's death had been the merciful part of Marshall's revenge. The real punishment would be living with the consequences of her choices, trapped in a marriage with a man who had proven himself capable of murder, raising a child whose father she could never publicly mourn. But as Marshall disappeared into the bedroom, Marcia noticed something he hadn't accounted for in his meticulous planning. The bullets from the pistol weren't missing. They were hidden in the small jewelry box on the bookshelf, exactly where Craig had told her to keep them separated from the gun for safety. Marshall Connolly was many things: patient, intelligent, ruthless. But he wasn't infallible. And Marcia was beginning to understand that the war wasn't over. It was entering a new phase where the stakes were no longer just her freedom, but the life of her unborn child. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. The final confrontation came 6 weeks later, on a cold December evening when early snow dusted the windows of their apartment. Marshall had settled into domestic life with the precision he brought to everything else: cooking dinner, managing finances, preparing for the baby's arrival with the methodical efficiency of a military operation. To outside observers, they appeared to be a reconciled couple preparing for parenthood. Marshall played the role of devoted husband flawlessly, attending doctor's appointments, assembling nursery furniture, discussing baby names with paternal enthusiasm that would have been touching if Marcia didn't know the truth beneath the performance. But Marcia had been preparing too. She'd spent weeks studying Marshall's routines, identifying the small gaps in his vigilance, learning to be as patient and calculating as he was. The bullets she'd retrieved from her jewelry box remained hidden, and she'd gradually modified her behavior to lull him into complacency. She played the role of defeated wife convincingly, subdued, compliant, focused entirely on the pregnancy. She stopped asking questions about Craig's death, stopped challenging Marshall's version of events, stopped showing any signs of rebellion. To Marshall, it appeared that Marcia had finally accepted her situation. The trigger for their final confrontation was unexpected: a phone call from Detective Rodriguez informing them that the investigation into Craig Savage's death was being reopened. New evidence had emerged, security footage from a neighboring business that provided a clearer view of the individual who'd entered the gym's kitchen. Marshall took the call with his characteristic calm, but Marcia saw the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his hand moved unconsciously to check his phone for messages. For the first time since his return, she glimpsed uncertainty in his carefully controlled demeanor. "They want to interview us both tomorrow," Marshall said after ending the call. "Routine questions about our relationship with Craig, timeline clarifications, that sort of thing." Marcia nodded, but her mind was racing. If the police had new evidence, if they were genuinely suspicious of Marshall's involvement, this might be her only opportunity to escape his control. But it also meant the danger to her and her unborn child had escalated dramatically. That evening, Marshall's facade finally cracked. "You called them," he said quietly, appearing in the nursery doorway where Marcia was folding baby clothes. "You contacted the police." "I don't know what you're talking about." Marshall stepped into the room, and Marcia saw something new in his expression, not anger, but a cold disappointment that was somehow more terrifying. "I've been monitoring our phone records, our internet usage, your movements. You haven't made any suspicious contacts. But someone did. Someone who knew enough about Craig's death to point the investigation in the right direction." Marcia's confusion was genuine. She hadn't contacted the police, hadn't spoken to anyone about her suspicions. But Marshall's paranoia had reached a breaking point where he was seeing betrayal in every coincidence. "You're losing control," she said quietly. "The perfect plan isn't so perfect anymore." Marshall moved closer, his gray eyes fixed on her face with predatory intensity. "The plan is fine, but I'm beginning to think I miscalculated one variable, which is whether keeping you alive is worth the complications you create." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Marcia felt the baby kick, as if responding to the sudden spike in her heart rate. "You won't hurt me," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Not while I'm carrying the baby. You've invested too much in this fantasy of being a father." Marshall's smile was sharp as a blade. "The baby was never part of my plan, Marcia. It was Craig's final insult, leaving me to raise his bastard child as my own. I tolerated the pregnancy because it kept you compliant, but the child itself." He shrugged. "Accidents happen to pregnant women all the time." For the first time since Craig's death, Marcia felt pure terror. Marshall wasn't just planning to eliminate her. He was planning to destroy Craig's final legacy, the one thing that remained of the man she'd loved. "You're insane," she whispered. "I'm practical." Marshall reached into his jacket and withdrew something that made Marcia's blood freeze. The magazine from her pistol, loaded with the bullets she thought she'd hidden. "Did you really think I wouldn't find these? I've been watching you retrieve them, one by one, thinking you were being clever." He slammed the magazine into the pistol she'd left on the nursery dresser, the gun she'd planned to use against him, now turned into the instrument of her own destruction. "The story writes itself," Marshall continued conversationally. "Pregnant wife, overwhelmed by grief and guilt over her affair, takes her own life rather than face the shame of police questioning about her lover's death." Marcia backed toward the window, her hands protectively covering her belly. "You won't get away with this. The police will know. The police will find exactly what I want them to find. A suicide note confessing your affair, your guilt over Craig's death, your inability to live with the consequences of your choices." Marshall raised the pistol, and Marcia saw her death in his cold gray eyes. But she also saw something else, the arrogance that had always been his weakness, the certainty that his plans were infallible. "That child will never know him," she said, repeating the words Marshall had spoken during their final phone call from Afghanistan. For a split second, Marshall's concentration wavered as he processed the significance of her words. In that moment of distraction, Marcia dove toward the nursery dresser, her hand closing around the one weapon Marshall hadn't accounted for. A heavy snow globe Craig had given her, a romantic gift from their brief time together. The globe caught Marshall in the temple with enough force to stagger him, and the pistol fired wild, the bullet embedding in the ceiling. Marcia lunged for the gun, her pregnant body moving with desperate strength, and they fought for control with the savage intensity of two people who understood that only one would leave the room alive. In the end, it was Marshall's own training that destroyed him. His muscle memory, honed by years of military service, automatically engaged the safety when he felt resistance on the trigger, a split-second hesitation that gave Marcia the advantage she needed. The final shot echoed through the apartment like thunder. When police arrived 20 minutes later, responding to reports of gunfire, they found Marcia Connolly cradling her belly and crying over the body of her husband. The evidence supported her statement perfectly. Marshall had attacked her in a jealous rage over her affair, and she defended herself and her unborn child. Detective Rodriguez found the suicide note Marshall had prepared in her handwriting, evidence of premeditation that transformed the case from domestic violence to attempted murder. The investigation into Craig Savage's death was quietly closed, with Marshall Connolly identified posthumously as the perpetrator. 3 months later, Marcia gave birth to a daughter she named Emma, after her grandmother, but also because it meant universal or whole. As she held her newborn child, she made a silent promise that Emma would know the truth about her father, that Craig Savage had been a flawed man who'd made terrible choices, but who died protecting what he loved. Marshall Connolly was buried in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His gravestone read, "Devoted husband and soldier." Only Marcia knew the complete truth about the man who destroyed himself in pursuit of perfect revenge. The war was over. The reckoning was complete. And for the first time in over a year, Marcia was truly free. Epilogue. 5 years later, Marcia stood in the cemetery where Craig Savage was buried, holding the hand of a bright 5-year-old girl with her father's eyes and her mother's strength. "Tell me about Daddy again," Emma said, placing a small bouquet of flowers on Craig's grave. "Your daddy was complicated," Marcia said carefully. "He made mistakes, but he loved us very much. And he would have been so proud of the strong, smart girl you've become." As they walked back to their car, Emma asked the question that Marcia had been dreading. "Why don't I have Daddy's last name?" Marcia knelt down to meet her daughter's eyes. "Because sometimes the names we're born with aren't the ones that truly belong to us. Your name is Emma Savage, and when you're old enough, that's exactly what your birth certificate will say." It was a promise she intended to keep. When Emma turned 18, she would learn the complete truth about her parentage, about the war that had been fought over her existence, and about the price of betrayal and revenge. But for now, it was enough that she was alive, loved, and free from the shadows of her parents' tragic choices. The reckoning was complete. The future belonged to Emma Savage, a child born from tragedy but destined for something better than the sins of her fathers. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.